You're 53 years old, you drag yourself out of bed after 8 hours of sleep, but you still feel like you've been hit by a bus. You make coffee, stare at the cup, and wonder how you're supposed to get through another day. By 10 a.m., you're already exhausted. Your body's moving, but your mind is screaming for a nap. You look at people 10 or 15 years younger than you, full of energy, making plans for after work. You quietly wonder, was I ever like that? When did I become this tired all the time? You're not lazy. You're not failing at life. You're Gen X. And there's a reason so many of us are feeling this way. It goes a hell of a lot deeper than simply getting older. It's burnout. But not the kind where you finally collapse and hit a wall. A completely different kind that moves in quietly while you keep working. But what if you never actually hit that wall? What if you still get up every morning, you go to work, you pay the bills, you take care of whatever needs taken care of, and from the outside, you completely look fine. And that's what makes this so easy to miss. Because nothing's falling apart. Because when you've spent most of your life being the person that gets things done, you don't necessarily notice how exhausted you've become. You just adjust. You have a little less patience than you used to. Things that never bothered you suddenly start getting on your nerves. You stop looking forward to those things that you used to enjoy. And maybe you just want to be left alone more than you used to. None of that stops us from functioning. So you keep going. And after a while, being exhausted doesn't even feel unusual anymore. It's just how we live. And the thing that keeps coming up while I was researching this video is independence. In 2026, a review comparing generations and burnout actually singled out Gen X for an emphasis on flexibility and independence. That probably doesn't surprise anybody who grew up Gen X. A lot of us learned pretty early that when something needed to be done, there wasn't always anyone around to help. And that actually turned out to be pretty useful. We became resourceful. We learned to trust our own judgment. We got comfortable solving problems without needing somebody to walk us through every single step. But here's the part I hadn't really considered. What happens when something you've always considered one of your strengths makes it harder to recognize when you're struggling? Because there's a big difference between being capable of handling something and being okay while you're handling it. And I think that's where "I've got it" can start working against us. If you spent 30 or 40 years seeing yourself as independent and capable, asking for help isn't necessarily your first instinct when you get overwhelmed. Your first instinct is usually the same one that's worked for our entire lives. I'll figure it out. And maybe that's why burnout can be so damn hard to see coming. Maybe Gen X isn't particularly good at avoiding burnout. Maybe we've just really gotten good at functioning through it. The next one hit a little closer to home. The older I get, the more I like being left alone. Apparently, I'm not alone in this either, because you guys watched an entire video of me talking about it. But while researching burnout, I came across something that made me look at this a little differently. One article gave the example of a 49-year-old man who would get home from work and sit in his car for 20 minutes before going inside. Not because he hated his family. He just needed 20 minutes where nobody needed anything from him. And I completely understand that. Because when you're already running on empty, another person isn't always company. Sometimes they're another conversation, another question, another decision, another little piece of energy you don't have much left of. So maybe you stop answering the phone as much. Saturday comes around and you'd rather stay home. Somebody cancels plans. Instead of you being disappointed, you're thinking, thank God. Eventually you just chalk it up to getting older. You know, I've become antisocial, or I don't like, people anymore. Maybe. But there's another possibility I hadn't really considered. How much of us, leave me alone is actually our personality, or how much of it is simply having nothing left in the tank? This isn't about whining. It's about realizing that the boundary lines have been completely erased, and you're the only one who can draw them back. And then there's work. Think about how much the workplace has changed in the last 30 or 40 years. We learned our jobs, long before email followed us everywhere, before there were smartphones and Zoom and Teams and Slack and, cloud everything. Every few years, there's another new system, another new piece of software, another management philosophy, another communication platform that's supposedly, going to make everything easier. And we've adapted. That's actually one of the things Gen X is known for. We're adaptable. The research describes Gen X as adaptable, practical, and independent. But nobody ever seems to ask whether constantly adapting eventually comes with a cost. Because after 30 or 40 years, it's not that we can't learn another system. We can. Here's new software, here's a new procedure, here's a new thing you need to learn to keep doing the job you already knew how to do. Maybe we're still perfectly capable of adapting. Maybe we're just getting tired of adapting. And I think that's where something interesting has happened with Gen X at work. Because being tired of adapting doesn't mean you stopped caring about doing a job. Maybe you're just starting to care a whole lot less about everything surrounding it. And I'm going to leave that one right there, because that's exactly what I'm going to dig into in the next video next week. Why so many Gen Xers haven't necessarily quit their jobs, but have quietly checked out of a lot of what comes with them. Maybe burnout doesn't always kick the door down. Maybe sometimes it moves in very quietly. And before you even realize it's there, burnout may have quietly started redecorating your personality. Think about that one for a second. You're still going to work. You're still dependable. You're still taking care of what needs to be done. But you're not quite the same person doing it anymore. You don't have the patience you used to have. Things that once sounded quite enjoyable that aren't anymore. You'd rather stay at home. You're more protective of your time. And the things you put up with for 20 years suddenly seem completely intolerable. Most of us probably have a pretty simple explanation for all that. I'm just getting older. And maybe some of it is. And maybe we've been blaming age for things that have nothing to do with age. Maybe some of what we've been calling getting older is burnout we just never knew was there.